I can't understand you. I asked you to stop forming from the feet slowly up to the head, and you were sick. But sit back, right? Be hell. Don't you ever watch movies? You ever seen thousands of movies? You must know what it's like. The training chimpanzees are kicking. I wanna operate a camera, anybody can do it. These are the home movies of a murderer. Can you go back about Minya, your fortune here? A man who in the 1980s would be uncovered as the most prolific serial killer in British history, and you ain't seen nothing yet. A civil servant whose extraordinary behavior will see him named with cruel irony as the kindly killer factory. That's why the camera went up the creek. Okay, fair enough, you think you know. All you have to do is point and click, you press the button. But was this murderer of young man driven by nature or nurture? Was the kindly killer born to kill? In the early winter of 1983, we had a problem arise in the Muswell Hill area of London. It was initiated by us receiving a call for a blocked toilet. Number 23, Cranley Gardens had been split into flats and bedsits. The residents had experienced problems with the plumbing for days. An engineer at the time went to attend to the blocked toilet, cleared the toilet, but did remark to us afterwards that he had never smelled such a bad smell in an apartment before in his life. Still, lavatories of the property continued to block. A plumber was sent in very urgently later on Saturday morning. He looked down in the drains beneath the house and saw what he knew was not what should be there. He observed what he said looked like some butcher's prepared meat and a few bones. She discovered that what was blocking the toilets was actually human flesh. On the 9th of February, 1983, sitting in my office minding my own business, I suddenly got a phone call from Peter Slade, who was the early term uniform inspector. He asked me if I'd go up to Cranley Gardens. He had a bit of a problem up there. I just got into the CID car and drove up there. I remember it was bitterly cold, it had been snowing. We stood outside this awful house and looked down the pit where the drains were, and he showed me 4 little pieces of flesh, each about 3 inches by half an inch, maybe an inch, and also 3 bones with a knuckle at each end. My first thought when I saw them was that they were from a human hand. The drains were blocked halfway up the building, so we knew that the blockage was originating from the very top. The tenant of the top flat was a 37-year-old executive officer at a nearby job center, Dennis Nilsen. He was due to return from work at 5:30, and my 2 colleagues and I walked up to the front door of the place in order to wait for him. Inside, we had no idea what we were gonna find. We knew we had a killer, we didn't know what he'd done. Nilsen walked in bang on cue at 5:30, and leading up to that, I had been thinking for 2 or 3 hours about what I was going to face. I knew that for someone to have flushed a dead body down the loo in small pieces, it was going to be somebody a little bit different. When Nilsen came in through that front door, I had already made a decision to be very light-hearted with him. I remember saying to Mr. Nilsen, he said, "Yes, that's me." And I said, "I'm Detective Chief Inspector J. I've come about your drains," and a little smile came across his face. He said, "Well, since when have the police been interested in blocked drains?" I said to him, "Well, you take me up to your flat, and I'll tell you all about it." The first thing that caught me was the smell of decomposing flesh. I said to him, "I'm here because your drains were blocked with human remains," and he said, "Oh my God, how awful." I just got a little bit closer to him, face to face, and looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Don't mess me about, where's the rest of the body?" He paused momentarily and said, "In plastic bags in the other room." Nilsen was immediately arrested and taken to the station for questioning. My deputy detective Inspector Steve McCusker sat in the back of the police car. I drove, and I don't know what prompted Steve to do this, but he suddenly said to Nilsen, "Are we talking about one body here or maybe two?" Nilsen said, "Neither." He said, "I think it's 16. Well, I can remember the steering wheel in the car shaking in my hands. The police could hardly believe their ears because this was all said in a very matter-of-fact voice, very dispassionate. Why dispassionate? Because this is a man without passion. His only passion came when he was in a murderous impulse, when he was overtaken by the other self. In Nilsen's wardrobes were 2 black plastic bags and several air fresheners. The bags contained dismembered body parts and 2 severed heads. In a tea chest, they found another torso, bones, and a skull. Under a drawer in the bathroom were legs and remains. It constituted the remains of 3 men. In the garden of an address in Cricklewood, investigators would identify the fragmented remains of at least 8. He told me off the record that if it hadn't have been 15, it would have been 150 if we hadn't caught him when we did, because there was no stopping. The whole thing was just totally bizarre. Dennis Nilsen was born in 1945 in Fraserburgh, a remote fishing community in northeast Scotland. His mother's family had lived there for generations. His father was a visiting Norwegian soldier. He was one of 3 children, the middle child. He had an older brother and a younger sister. He never really knew his father. Nilsen, as a child, was a bit of a loner. He didn't really have friends because everybody thought he was weird. His mother said she could never cuddle him. He didn't have tactile relationships with anyone except his grandfather. Nilsen's father was absent from the household, and so he had formed a bond with his grandfather. They would walk together, fish together, and so forth. The boy's grandfather would often be away for weeks at a time, trawling the fishing grounds of the North Sea. One day he came home from school, and his mother said to him, "Would you want to see your granddad?" He said, "Oh, I didn't know he was there." Even so, he was very pleased about that, and he went into the kitchen. There on the kitchen table was a long box, and in it was his grandfather. Nobody had prepared him for the fact that he was dead. Nilsen's grandfather had died at sea, and his corpse had been brought home for burial. He had this picture in his mind, imprinted, of seeing his grandfather white as a sheet, and I think that affected him deeply. Nilsen would later say that when he saw his grandfather laid out in the front sitting room after his grandfather's death, this was when Nilsen first began to associate love with death, an inert body. From that moment, I'm convinced, I can't prove it, but I'm convinced that his idea of love and his idea of death fused and became linked, inextricably linked. When his mother said to him, "Your granddad's gone to a better place," the little boy, aged 6, thought, "Well, if he's gone to a better place, why didn't you take me with him?" He would sometimes even go out into the sea and simulate drowning as a means of being with him. Aged 15, Nilsen would leave his home behind. Nilsen would join the army, specifically he joined the catering corps, which is of course where he learned his butchering skills, skills that were going to be put to use in a different context when he was back in civilian life. In 1983, the discovery of human flesh blocking the drains of 23 Cranley Gardens had led to the arrest of civil servant Dennis Nilsen. He claimed to have taken the lives of at least 15. Investigators learned that he'd had a lonely childhood punctuated by the fact that at 15 years old he had joined the Army Catering Corps. Early on, the young Nilsen would stand out from his fellow new recruits. He was quite argumentative, not picking an argument in a nasty sort of way, but if you said that photograph is black and white, he'd let you know it was saying he was white and so forth. He was quite contrary as a person, really. He wished to sit listening to the Beatles and Rolling Stones. He would read the Parade magazines, which had like girly magazines of the day, and he'd probably be reading broadsheets, and he'd also listen to classical music. I remember there was once a scrap in the Baroque room, and I think he scratched and slapped, he didn't thump like the rest of us. I remember somebody saying, "Oh, you Nilsen. You're weird." The teenage Nilsen harbored a secret. What's interesting about the army experience is that it would have been impossible for Nilsen to have shared the fact that he was gay with any of his colleagues. Basically, they just didn't accept homosexuals at all, so if somebody was gay, they kept very, very quiet about it. During his time in the army, Nilsen began a lifelong interest in photography. He maintained it was his hobby photography, but it was much more important than a hobby. It was self-realization. He used to get his colleagues in the army to pretend that they were corpses as if they had been slain in battle, and he would take photographs of that. They thought this was a bit odd, but they would go along with it. Nilsen would spend 11 years in the Armed Forces Catering Corps, rising to the rank of corporal. I think he was a bit of a bully underneath, but with his rank, you know. Once he was in charge of a room, I think he pretended to be a boy a bit. But just before his 27th birthday, Nilsen would reject the familiarity in order of army life and strike out on his own. In 1970s London, he found a thriving gay scene. He was living in a large urban metropolitan area where clearly there were gay pubs that he would be able to visit for the first time. People were friendlier back then. People wore jackets, and life in London was exciting at that time. He wasn't a bad-looking man, and he seemed quite educated, quite good to talk to. He chose his words well, fluently, but after a few minutes, you'd realize that he's not talking to you or with you, but he's talking to himself because he doesn't pay attention to anything but what he himself is saying. "What are you doing switching the bloody thing on and off for? You never made me a cameraman. You know, no. I'm not gonna do anything pornographic." Nilsen joined the Metropolitan Police. It is not unusual for these individuals to seek out a profession of authority, whether it's a police officer or some other civil servant type job where they could have control over someone else. This is what is so stimulating to them. He's living a double life. He's living a life of the police constable, but at the same time, he's also living a double life talking about being able to express his sexuality, and of course, that inevitably would lead to conflict. After 11 months, Nilsen tired of the police and quit. He was also becoming disillusioned with the transient nature of the gay scene and began to seek more permanent companionship. What he was looking for was a relationship, somebody to share his life with. You didn't go out to find companionship for the club, you just went out to pick up. That's what generally people did, they weren't there for an affair or a relationship, they just wanted the one-night stand. He got a job with Manpower Services in the heart of the West End, but the opinionated young Scot struggled to bond with anyone. He's not somebody who's going to make friends very easily. He's not somebody who's going to be the life and soul of the party, he's far too self-centered, he's far too self-obsessed. He harassed London tenants being squeezed by the Department of Employment, London Transport, big chain stores, supermarkets. He cut down everything, so he's got this quite isolated existence, which he finds it difficult to make friends and which is very difficult for him to socialize in any normal way. That isolation would mean that he would return to his home and lose himself in alcohol. He was a drunk, and frankly, I'm not sure he was an alcoholic, but he did like to get drunk. I cannot stand, I've got the theater bottle party, and he would listen intently to music. Nilsen was more at ease with machines and objects than he was with people, so music was a way of controlling what was being heard. You can't control the person who carpets control. What he's got to say, and how he's gonna react, and how he's gonna respond, but you can control the record player. Here's to you, Mrs. Robinson. In 1976, Nilsen met a young drifter called David Galician. Galician was unemployed and living in a hostel, and although they were seemingly unsuited, Nilsen sought out a flat for them both to set up home together. Yes, yeah. Okay, come on. Oh man, I don't know. Sign, go on, I already am going on today. Okay, shut up, bloody dog, me and my bloody slippers again. It is China's slippers I give it. I'll bring this bloody neck. I touched it again. Melrose Avenue was a very old kind of building. It had lots of furniture in it that had been bought during the war, and it was quite an old place. The carpets weren't very nice, so it was quite a run-down building. Tear passed one last night, son asleep. Drink over there at me here, crash bang. What? Oh look, they moved the cup up there publicly. That right? We're gonna stay. I hope the bloody ceiling falls down. 4th Army Forester, rep straight across hits a dog. Poor dog food. Budgie got a big brow, that wakes you up as well. Quick jumped bloody great chunks of masonry. I could kill someday that they had French windows which led into a garden. Nobody from upstairs could get into the garden here, only he had the entrance through the French windows. Here, a big nincompoop boy over here. Oh yeah, over here, stand up, don't stand near me, a big poke. But Nilsen's overpowering and controlling nature would drive a wedge between the companions. David Galician walked out on him after about 18 months, and that really hurt Nilsen, I'm sure it did. He was essentially a lonely man by virtue of the fact that he scared everyone away, and they all left him. So the thing he's searching for is companionship, a relationship, and it's the one thing that psychologically, sociologically, he's not set up to be able to do. Then he began to invite more and more people back, hoping someone would stay. He did ask me to move in, but I said, I don't think I can put up with you and that bottle. The bottle comes between us, there's too much of it. You've got to stop that. If you stopped it, you'd be a lovely decent giant to live with. But he couldn't stop that. He couldn't stop that. You seem to be very into yourself, that was all him. He never hardly asked anything about me. Probably out of curiosity from having talked his death, but he lied on here in July. Could you go back a bit? I mean, yeah, you're 5, Janilla. Yes, the lonely Nilsen increasingly took refuge in his morbid private fantasies. He used to lie on the floor in front of a mirror and put glue on his lips and make his eyes look bloodshot, and he got satisfaction out of regarding himself in the mirror in that way. Not, I don't think, an emotional satisfaction, but a deep requirement of his nature which was obviously perverted. He would he passed out and would fall to the floor. You'd go rushing up to him, and he'd just be lying there, but I actually know that he wasn't asleep, he wasn't out, he wasn't passed out. He was awake, and he was staying in a position of a kind of unsafe, stretched position. I believe he was pretending to be dead all the while. Nilsen continued to play the role of the unremarkable civil servant. He gets up in the morning, he's a civil servant, he goes to work, he comes home at night, he tends his garden, he cooks for himself, he has a dog, which he calls Bleep. Babe, come on, we say for a trap. So there's a sense in which these are the banalities, the ordinariness of suburban life. But, of course, Nilsen doesn't really have a sense of how an ordinary life is for most people. He experiences it because Nilsen wants to be extraordinary. On New Year's Day 1979, 33-year-old Dennis Nilsen woke up next to a teenager he'd met in a pub the night before. The lonely Manpower Services employee later claimed he couldn't face the thought of the sleeping boy leaving him there. There came a moment when the murderous impulse to keep this man, not to let him go, overtook him. Nilsen took a tie, wrapped it around the boy's neck, and pulled. He was astonished at his strength at the moment of the murder. He was amazed at how strong he was because he was not normally a very strong man. Once the murder had occurred and Nilsen had before him a corpse, he then, in a very peculiar fashion, looked after the corpse. Now for the first time, Dennis Nilsen had the means to live out his darkest and most secret fantasies. He would run a bath, he would bathe it, clean it, he would then make it comfortable, he would dry it, put it into the bed, put it into an armchair. Nilsen lived with the corpse for a week. He then placed the naked body under the floorboards, where it remained for almost 8 months. If you have this body, you have to find some way to get rid of it, and you certainly don't want it to be identified as quickly as possible. Nilsen was efficient, he couldn't relate to a person emotionally. He could relate to a corpse as something that had to be disposed of, it was a problem that had to be solved. That's much easier than dealing with people and their emotions. Nilsen's garden would provide the solution. He burned his body in the garden of Melrose Avenue, obliterating him and spreading his ashes to the 4 winds. It was not until 2005 that the victim would be identified as 14-year-old Stephen Holmes. His murder would prove to be merely the beginning. I think the first murder that any serial killer commits is always the revealing murder. He enjoyed doing it, and I think it's that enjoyment that he got from that first murder that propelled him to kill again and again and again. Well, this is Soho, in the heart of Soho, Old Compton Street, and this is the area that Nilsen used to favor. He'd come out in his spare time to this kind of area, and to gay pubs in particular, in order to make contact with people. So he had contact with a lot of youngsters who were coming to London thinking the streets were paved with gold and who were probably of no fixed abode or may have run away from home, dropouts. That kind of person, the people that Nilsen chose to meet were, in fact, people he had a sticky, uncanny knack for recognizing, people who were lonely and would be most likely to accept an invitation to go home. Often, there is no record of these people being reported as missing, and therefore he's targeting a particularly vulnerable group that many other serial killers would target. While living at Melrose Avenue, Dennis Nilsen would pick up and strangle to death a further 11 young men. If you strangle someone, you feel it, you can touch it, you just grab whatever is at hand and pull. I have always suspected that Nilsen would strangle the people that he really didn't want to go. At midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, the ones that he wanted to stay, the ones he didn't particularly want to be with, they would just go at the end of the night. That may be true to some extent, but I would look at it in a very different way. I would say that he wanted the bodies to be there because it assured him how in control he was of other people. This is what arouses individuals like Nilsen, to be in complete control and domination of others. Nilsen used the bodies of his victims sexually and in other ways. Nilsen wanted to stay close to these bodies almost as if they were a form of trophy. He wanted to express his power, his complete and utter domination of these young men, even after they're dead. After he killed them, he would sometimes bring them out and put them in a chair and have conversations with them as if they were still alive. They can watch television with him, he can talk to them. He even would go so far as to come home from work and find the corpse sitting in the same armchair that he'd left him in that morning and saying to him, "Guess what happened to me today?" So this was a substitute for real human company. Nilsen is so self-obsessed, so desperate for his opinion to be the only opinion that counts and matters, he finds it easier to relate it, to have a conversation with a dead young man who isn't capable of answering back. He would then keep the corpses for quite a few days until they became unbearable. He would eviscerate them, He would put the spleen and stuff into the garden, something to live with, and then put the remains left over from the corpses under the floorboards. In obsessive-compulsive personality, where somebody is attuned to details and orderliness and so on, it is very common in prolific serial killers because that personality trait will help them elude law enforcement. They're aware of forensic evidence, they'll clean things up meticulously. Ultimately, the bodies that were serving as Nilsen's companions would become an annoyance to him. They were in the way. He needed to get rid of them for a variety of reasons. Firstly, they'd smell. Also, they were an annoyance to him because he kept wanting to bring more live young men back to his flat. I would actually stay there for the night or maybe for the weekend or whatever. All I can say is that the smell from Melrose Avenue, which you would put down to dry rot or whatever, rising to, I don't know, animal smells. It's an awful, ready smoke, nasty, but nothing other than this really stirred. Ate nothing at all, with no further room under the floorboards. The decomposing corpses were removed, cut into manageable pieces, and taken into the garden. In the middle of the night, he would have a huge bonfire in his garden, burning the remains, disguising the smell with rubber tires. The local children came and danced around the bonfire because they thought it was a lot of fun, having not the faintest idea of what was going on. Dennis Nilsen had murdered and disposed of 12 young men without arousing suspicion. In 1981, he moved to a new address where his behavior would become increasingly more bizarre. Between 1979 and 1981, civil servant Dennis Nilsen had murdered and disposed of 12 young men at his flat in Cricklewood. In October of '81, he moved to a rented top-floor flat at 23, Cranley Gardens, where his disturbed fantasies would take a new twist. 21-year-old Kyle's daughter met the seemingly kind and friendly Nilsen at the Black Cap in Camden. He took me about 3 spice, he was a nice guy. He didn't have murderer chattered across his face or anything like that. She was nice, and I slept with him. What he did was, first of all, attack him from behind with a tie and strangled him. He thought he was dead, but he wasn't. Then he dragged me into the bath water. While he thought he was dead, he got himself a rum and coke and lit another cigarette and said to himself, "Oh my God, here we go again," as if this had been done with somebody else. He described it as being almost in a trance, that he was doing this act without even realizing that he was doing it, and that's fairly typical. Serial murderers will talk about almost waking up and realizing, "Oh my gosh, what am I doing?" When he realizes the man was alive, he then got extra blankets out, he rubbed his legs to get the blood circulating properly, he put on an extra fire, a heart massage. Now somehow, the resuscitation, he brought me back to life. I was there for 3 days. You've got a classic example of Nilsen initially killing, trying to kill, believing he's killed the victim, but then realizing that the young man is actually still alive. Then Nilsen goes into Good Samaritan mode, trying to help the young man get better. Nilsen is able to kind of inhabit a parallel universe in which he no longer sees himself as being someone who's doing wrong but actually interprets his actions as somebody who's doing good. If you told me that what happened was I got caught up in the sleeping bag set, and that was it, and I believed him because you don't think that somebody's gonna try and kill you. Anyway, he did. Carl's daughter would not be the only recipient of Nilsen's Good Samaritan act. At least 3 more young men would be strangled and then allowed to live. The attacks would remain uninvestigated by the police. Most of the police would say, "Well, you were in a bondage game, and it's your fault, you participated." And the absolute humiliation of saying, "Oh gosh, I don't want to be known for this kind of behavior," really protects the serial murderer. It appears Nilsen's odd behavior was not only reserved for strangers. I fell asleep on the floor, I wouldn't get into the bed. I woke up, and he was standing over me. He had what I call an apple knife, but behind him there was smoke, and there was a gas heater that used to be on the wall, had apparently fallen off. No, I couldn't possibly have knocked that off of my feet, and it was quite bad, the room was full of smoke. I said, "What's the knife for?" He said he was trying to cut it, trying to get it right off the wall in case there was an explosion. I'm positive that when I went to sleep, that gas fire wouldn't have been armed because he was already asleep and because it was quite a much milder night. That's all I remember thinking, but then again thought no more of it. I have to believe that he was going to do something, he was trying to fix it. He aimed the knife at me, but not everyone would escape with their lives. With every serial murderer, although they start out slowly, they then become more frenetic, and they will start killing a lot more people, a lot more closely in time. The addiction becomes so overwhelming that the corpses pile up on one another. At Cranley Gardens, 3 men would suffer the same fate as the 12 at Melrose Avenue. But unlike his previous residence, Nilsen's top-floor flat had no space under the floorboards. He would boil their skulls to get all the flesh off, and then he would chop them up into little bits. To him, the people were just about the same and equivalent to the meat he was chopping up in the army, they had absolutely no reason or meaning emotionally to him. It was just something he did. Half of one was under the bars, the pieces of another were in the wardrobe in black bags. Well, the day that I went back there on the very last day, he wouldn't let me into the flat. He was in the strangest mood I've ever seen him in, he was completely flustered, and I couldn't understand what was happening. The dog ran down the stairs. He said, "How the door, but don't go in," and I thought, "Charlie, I've known you all this time. He won't let me into your flat." I said, "He doesn't trust me." Obviously, he bought the dog back off and he said to me, "He didn't go in." He said, "Now understand, there's something here, Anto," and I couldn't wrap that out. Nilsen's desperate efforts at disposal would be his undoing. On the 9th of February, blocked drains would lead to his discovery and arrest. Scotland Yard launched its biggest murder investigation today after a pathologist confirmed that human remains found in a sewer outlet were parts of 3 bodies. For some strange reason, the minute they said Muswell Hill, they gave no address, they gave nothing. I seem to know that this is him, it's him. I don't know why I would think that, and then an hour later I was listening more intently, and then they said in Cranley Gardens, and it was the house. Just officer in custody, Nilsen would describe the murder of 15 young men in minute detail. These are no reason to get worked up about it. All right, if you've arrested me, so let's get on with it. Nilsen gave us every bit of information that he could think of. I mean, we interviewed him 16 times over the next few months. Throughout the interviews, Nilsen was totally matter-of-fact, quite cold, there was no remorse, there was no indication of any remorse at all. In November, Dennis Nilsen was sentenced to life imprisonment. Over a 4-year period, he had taken the lives of 15 young men. But was the so-called kindly killer born to kill? Nada Slauson was clearly born with a flawed gene, which was bound to cause problems in one way or another. Just as some people are born with a gene which makes them prone to anger or jealousy, nobody is born with an inevitability about his future. The future is shaped by experience. It may shape the gene which is flawed, but that is not the same thing as saying that there's evil inherent. So Nilsen could have turned out to be a completely different person, not a stable person because of the inherited gene. He would still be flawed, but he need not have become a murderer. The idea that he was born evil is nonsense. He was brought up in relatively banal, ordinary circumstances. There were certain elements of his life which were odd or which were difficult for him to overcome, but the circumstances of his childhood and the trials and tribulations of his childhood were not something that were unique to Dennis Nilsen but common to many hundreds of thousands of young people. If Dennis Nilsen was born to kill, so would those hundreds of thousands of young people who had similar circumstances that they had to deal with when they were growing up. So no, I don't believe that Dennis Nilsen was born to kill. You can be born with a flaw which you've got to keep under control. If you don't keep it under control, it's your fault. I don't think he was born to kill, but certainly circumstances made him that way. Death was a necrophiliac, he was a control freak. I think if he couldn't get what he wanted from a person, like some nights he couldn't with me, then he would, if he wanted it and he was drunk and he was in the mood for it, I mean sex, then he would do something to get it, he would go out of his way to get it, he would do whatever it took. I think all of these people are, to a large degree, born to kill. It's a biopsychosocial problem, but biology, in my judgment, has a very large component. We don't know exactly what the specific biological or neurobiological problem is, whether it's genetic, hormonal, chemical, electrical, brain damage, a combination of factors. There have to be a number of things to go wrong in order for a serial sexual murderer to be created. Nilsen himself claimed to have wrestled to find a reason for his crimes. It amazes me that I have no tears for these victims, I have no tears for myself or those bereaved by my actions. Am I a weak person constantly under pressure who just couldn't cope with it and escapes to wreak revenge against society through the haze of a bottle of spirits? Or maybe it's because I was just born an evil man. Self-serving crap for me. This is just specious nonsense, self-serving nonsense to try and justify his behavior. He's nothing, he's a liar, he's taken human lives. I feel sorry for his mother, to give birth to such a monster.